the opportunity to talk to you all. Thank you, Dean, for inviting me, staff, President. This is a kind of I guess, a special charge in my life, is to introduce design to people. Everyone has a kind of an idea of what they think design is, and they may have even had some courses in design. So hopefully, without offending people, I'll give you maybe a different perspective on what design is all about, what it can be. So I'm sure you've heard conversations in coffee shops, hallways, faculty lounges about design thinking, about agile design, service design, all sorts of cool sounding things. But actually, as cool sounding as they all are, they're just sort of the sparkly bits that were chipped off of a much larger idea of design. So there's a saying that business often turns good ideas into fads, governments turn fads into bad ideas, and bad ideas turn bad. So what I want to do is make an intervention on behalf of what I think is a good idea, design. And I think design is a right good idea for our times right now, as chaotic as it is, complex as it is. It's a better good idea than people really understand or have given credit for. And this is going to be a short, curated introduction to the story of design. I'm not going to tell you about what design is going to become now. I think the story is important. It's a narrative. Because design is actually the human intervention that has caused the realities that we're in now. And what we often perceive ourselves as, our memories, are often made up of our encounters with design. So looking around, not only is this grand building a design, creating a physical space, university you're in is a design. The kind of professions that you're in or going into, they're all designs. They're not natural, they weren't found in nature, they're something people have created. So I want to talk a bit about that story because, interestingly, for some reason, it's invisible. And we don't have the language even to talk to one another about what design is, other than maybe style and fashion. So, and I'm going to break one of my rules. Don't tell your husband, but I'm breaking a rule. Never read off a slide. But this is one of my favorite sayings, and it really sort of speaks to what I want to talk about. So there are these two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way. Nods at them and says, "Morning, boys. How's the water?" The two young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over to the other and goes, "What the hell is water?" So, as much as we use water, we buy water, it's a utility. We don't know what it is, it turns out. I talked to scientists about this who specialize. We don't know what water is. It's a mystery. I've looked up some of the literature. Strange. There's some strange things about water. So, in the same way, design like water is a mystery. And even though we're immersed in it, totally immersed in it, it's a mystery. So, the young fish didn't get the answer in their schools as to what water is. What I want to hope to change is that the young fish today will have an understanding of what design is, what they're immersed in. What is it? So there's two questions that comes out of this when we ask that question, what the hell is design? The first question is, what has it been? What's been the history of design? And the second one is, what do we want it to be? I'm not going to talk to the second question. today I don't have enough time really to do that. I want to talk to the first one because I think the story of design is really important. It's really essential. Next time I'm here, maybe I can talk about what we want it to be. So, the genesis of design story is human beings being human. My colleagues and I make the case that design was the first tradition of inquiry. And I'll talk a bit about that later. So I want to tell this story in three movements. The first one is the first tradition, the design mind. And these are going to be short, painless, hopefully. So the second one is the wise hand. And the third one is the third culture. And this will all be crystal clear here in a few minutes, I hope. So, the first tradition, the design mind. It's very interesting because our ancestors began to make connections and structure meaning with the natural order of things that was very chaotic. So they created spiritual belief systems, they created social systems, they created a lot of things to make sense out of this world that they were in that was hostile, chaotic. I love this particular piece because it's obviously an altarpiece and it's in relationship to the natural world that they're in. It's a very dangerous animal. They want to have some way of making a connection with that animal so that it works out for everybody in the end. So the design mind shows up in artifacts. And earliest artifacts they've found so far of designed things is over 3 million years ago. Those artifacts, in fact, we have artifacts that are older than the specimens, the skeletons and that of our ancestors. So it happens when they find these artifacts that it will identify whether or not it's human activity and whether the sort of skeletons that are there with them were in the human family or not. The anthropologists use that. So, in the beginning, when they were making connection with the natural order of the world, trying to make some kind of sense out of it, they started making or designing the cosmos, a kind of a design of divine order. So what was the cosmos that they're in? And that's carried through to contemporary times as well. What is it that makes sense to them about how we exist as humans? Those are all designs. That's the design mind at work, allowing us to make sense out of chaos. So the second movement is in a pre-Socratic era. Sophia, you remember the compound word philosophy? Sophia is the term that means wisdom. So pre-Socratic, Sophia meant the wise hand. And the Greeks at that time were sort of fascinated about how they could make something appear in the world that never existed before. They sort of would reflect on how they could make a ship appear in the harbor that hadn't existed, or a temple. So they had a lot of interest in how they made stuff, how stuff could come into existence by their hands, by their human ability. Thinking and doing was interconnected. And this is going to be sort of a dramatic change in the story of design as we're going along. But during the same period, these gods appeared, and they weren't just in Greece, they were in the Middle East, they were in Africa and place. There were these gods. They were usually blacksmiths, usually lame. And the one that the Greeks, the story that I know the most about, is the god Hephaestus, who's a lame god. And Hephaestus is kind of I guess, the archetypal designer because of his handicap. He had to make things to overcome his inability to be a full god. So he was famous. He had, believe it or not, for the tech folks, he was famous for having these golden robots that would serve him and carry things for him. He had winged chariots that would carry him around. He made all this stuff. And the other gods that weren't handicapped in any way said, that's cool. Could you make me armor? Could you make me jewelry? Could you make me stuff? So he started making stuff for the other gods. And the interesting thing, of course, in this is that dimension of service came into play then for design, is that design is service related. It's not an individual act. You're not making stuff for yourself. You're making stuff for other people. And that started off with this sort of archetypal image of what designers were. So Hephaestus was just an example. But the interesting thing is that somehow now, and in my schooling certainly, we attributed every major human achievement as either a discovery or an invention. But the reality is that humans didn't discover fire. We designed it. We didn't discover fire. We designed the technology of fire. But we don't attribute it to design nowadays, or we haven't. And the other thing is that, for instance, we didn't invent the wheel. My great Uncle Sven didn't stumble over a wheel in the forest and say, oh God, if I had another one, I'd invent a bicycle. It didn't happen that way. We didn't invent things, we were designing things. Somehow we attribute every major achievement in human history to invention or discovery and not to design. So we've lost language, we've lost a tradition, we've lost a lot of background in what design is and what it's done. And what I hope to do is sort of bring some of that back. My colleagues and I are working to reintroduce this notion and that we can start to share language about what design is about, what it can do. So in the post-Socratic period, Sophia started to lose ground. And Sophia was divided between those who actually split away from those who made stuff and those who reflected on things. Sophia became the idea of wisdom for those who reflected on like first principles, philosophers. Those who made things, like carpenters and potters and others, fell to the bottom of the social hierarchy. And that's what we still have today, blue collar, white collar. We still have that same sort of breakdown of between people who make things and people who think about things. Started losing a lot of visibility then too when that happened, is the idea of design when it was split out that way to just thinking about things or just doing stuff. We started losing what it was we had done in the past when those things were combined. So we started thinking about the things that were already had been caused to come into existence, real things. Like laptops. Sorry about this. This is. So, started thinking about things that were caused to exist. And the example of this is then Aristotle's four causes that you probably are aware of: matter, means, forms, ends, that explain pretty much everything that was in existence. But Middle Ages came along, and they said, no, form, ends, belongs to religion and art. So that was dropped out. So what we were left with the causes that described everything to us was science and technology. It became very strong in our traditions. But we're interested in reconstituting Sophia, getting back to the wise hand, because realize it doesn't make any sense to not think about what we're doing. It makes a lot of sense to be very careful to do what we think is important and why. So we're interested in causing things to come into existence. How do we cause things to become part of reality? So what we had to do is go back and start to add in causes. Not only as designers do we have to add back in form and ends, but we have to add in intention, we have to add in particulars. This is just one sort of schema, but it says we have to go back in and gain lost ground and put things back into place that we begin to look at, because we're causing things to come into existence now. They're not natural. So one of the things that was unfortunate too that happened along the way is that there was this split, not just between thinking and making, but there was a split between sciences and the arts and humanities. And C.P. Snow, in his famous Two Cultures talk back in '59, said that there were these two cultures of inquiry that are so different that they will never come together. They will never be able to talk to one another. So there's been an ongoing argument ever since then about whether or not those two cultures can ever get along, ever. Can humanists ever talk with scientists? Can engineers ever talk to artists? There was another problem in that we discovered you can't make an ought from an is. So no matter how well you describe and explain something, you can't create an ought from that. You can't take action based on a description and explanation. It can't happen. People do it all the time. They find ways around it. I think the Germans call it Sachzwang, coercion by fact. There's all sorts of ways that people get around jumping this chasm between the is and the ought. So, conveniently, the thing that does bridge that is design. So that's what design is about, is going from the ises in the world, explanations, descriptions, to what ought to be, what's desired to be, but without the design bridge. We have these problems. I think one of the problems, for instance, nowadays, as an example, is global warming. We have incredible research on global warming, descriptions and explanations. And the scientist will say, and therefore we should. That's a mistake. So people immediately catch or say, oh, you just politicized it, and I don't trust you anymore. Because now they've turned an is into an ought without having gone through a design process. They're no longer acting as very good descriptors and explainers of the real world. They've gone to what people will call politics or something else. But it's a problem nowadays, a big problem nowadays, I think. So, what we're interested in now is a new disruptive innovation. Design is a third culture of inquiry. And this third culture, tertium quid, it shares things with science, it shares things with humanities and the arts. It's logical, rational, it's aesthetic, it's all those things, but it's not driven by either one of those. It has its own axioms, postulates, traditions, everything. So I was telling somebody earlier, as an architect, I was told that design was this midpoint between science and art. So they made us take courses in fine arts, and they made us take courses in calculus and engineering and things like that. Stanford would actually make you have a degree in art, fine art, and a degree in engineering before they could call you a designer. It's a very painful way of becoming a designer, by the way. So anyway, we're advocating this notion of the third form of inquiry. So the change is that change is description, cause is explanation, and then we add in because. Intention, spelled two different ways here that I'll talk about a little bit, but we add in because. So we don't exclude science or art or any of the other traditions. We include them plus what we need as designers. So we're trying to regain some ground that was lost, that we start to make design a little more visible. We start sharing some vocabulary and understandings of what design inquiry is. And part of that is what's called centering design. You might have heard some of this in the hallways and that again. But there are these two arms that have developed in the recent evolution of design. One is a branch that's kind of a dehumanization, removing humans from the design process. And the other is humanization. So you'll hear or you'll read about human-centered design, different kinds of human-centered design, life-centered design, and then something called the Anthropocene. So these are, and this will be on the exam, by the way, so take notes. These are the fruits of this evolutionary tree. So on the left is the list of what Wiki thinks is the sort of traditional standard fields of design. Whether they share anything in common or not, this is what you'll find as fields of design. On the right are labels for designing that I have found just over a 2-week period that come across my screen. I mean, it's staggering the number of different kinds of designing that people are talking about, trying to sell, and whether or not any of them have anything in common, it would probably be a good PhD study, but we're not assuming that we're all meaning the same thing. When people say design, I have to stop and talk them through until they can tell me whether they're talking about creative problem solving, are they talking about planning, are they talking about product development, what are they talking about? Because we throw around those code words all the time because we're in our own communities and we get quite comfortable and we have these shortcuts, and design is one of those shortcut things. It doesn't help us understand or talk to one another when we're trying to understand. This is a short film given the history from industrial era up through the 50s about what they call innovations and discoveries. And now they're no longer on the globe anywhere is a natural system. Scientists can't find a natural system to study that's not been affected by human beings. The point is we've made such an impact on the globe up to this period of time that the geologists have changed the name of this era, and it's now called the Anthropocene, the human influence era. And since the 50s, it's been an incredible climb. So,
this is the story of how one species changed a planet. The latest chapter of our story begins in England 250 years ago. Fueled by coal, then oil, several brilliant inventions appeared. They ignited the Industrial Revolution, which spread like wildfire through Europe, North America, Japan, then elsewhere. The great railways, then cars and highways, connected people across the globe. Medical discoveries saved millions of lives. New artificial fertilizers meant we could feed more people. Population rose rapidly. But this was nothing compared with what was to come. The 1950s marked the beginning of the Great Acceleration. Globalization, marketing, tourism, and huge investments helped fuel enormous growth. People swarmed to cities, which became even more powerful engines of creativity. In a single lifetime, the well-being of millions has improved beyond measure. Health, wealth, security, longevity, never have so many had so much. Yet 1 billion are malnourished. In a single lifetime, we have grown into a phenomenal global force. We move more sediment and rock annually than all natural processes, such as erosion and rivers. We manage 3/4 of all land outside the ice sheets. Greenhouse gas levels this high have not been seen for over 1 million years. Temperatures are increasing. We have made a hole in the ozone layer. We are losing biodiversity. Many of the world's deltas are sinking due to damming, mining, and other causes. Sea level is rising. Ocean acidification is a real threat. We are altering Earth's natural cycles. We have entered the Anthropocene, a new geological epoch dominated by humanity. This relentless pressure on our planet risks unprecedented destabilization. But our creativity, energy, and industry offer hope. We have shaped our past. We are shaping our present. We can shape our future. You and I are part of this story. We are the first generation to realize this new responsibility. As the population grows to 9 billion, we must find a safe operating space for humanity, for the sake of future generations. Welcome to the Anthropocene.
Now, I think it's time for not only for a rediscovery of what design is, but it's to take responsibility for design activity at whatever level we're doing it, whether we call ourselves designers or not. So what's occurring is that there are these nascent design approaches now that are beginning to emerge. Systemic design is one. Incipient design are also coming along in advanced design that are sort of up to the challenge of working within this era of the Anthropocene, because it is incredibly complex, interconnected, and consequential. The question will be, what will we cause design to become? So I often go to conferences and people will ask, well, where do you think organization such and such will be in 10 years, or where will it be in 20 years? And they do this kind of futuring piece, and I ask them, the question is, where do you want it to be? You can wait for stuff to happen to you, or you can make it happen because you desire it to be. So what do you want? What do we want design to be? And we certainly don't want it to kind of create the sort of world that we've got now that we're handing on to the next generations.